Unstitched is a book that I didn't set out to write. I am a novelist originally. I'm also an essayist, and I'm also a journalist. But Unstitched is a combination of narrative nonfiction and memoir. And how it came about to be written was this. I was working as a librarian in a one-room rural Vermont library, which may or may not be familiar to a bunch of you. I was recently divorced, and I was the single mother. And I realized as I was working there that someone was breaking in after hours. And I came to realize this through the scent of cigarette smoke. And it was a mystery to me at first. And then gradually I realized that the person who was breaking in lived nearby, although he was a stranger to me. And it's a complicated story, but there are two things that are really important to know about this. The first is it was rumored that he was a heroin user. And the second is that I was afraid of him. And so I did everything in my power to prevent him from breaking in, including calling the state police, pursuing the legal system, but yet I couldn't prevent him from breaking in. And eventually what happened is this. One of my trustees walked in on him on a frigid January evening, and he ran out. He ran back to his house. He put a shotgun in his mouth, and he killed himself. And for me, it was one of these moments in my life where everything in my life just stopped because it was such a violent death and it was so incredibly unexpected. So I forced myself to really pause this sort of single mother life that I had at the time that was very busy and was filled with all kinds of things. And I forced myself to really ask, what was my role in this man's death? And there's a line in the book that sums up where I was at the time. And it says, I was beginning to wonder if I was a minor character in a much larger story where the plot line wasn't clear to me. And at that moment, the plot line was not at all clear to me. But for me, it was clear that I was still part of the story. So Unstitched comes out of that original action, and it comes out of my questioning where I am in this story. There are two stories that happen in Unstitched, and they're both interconnected. And the first is I seek to understand the how of addiction. And so I reach out to local medical workers. I reach out to the local police chief. I stop in at his office and I talk to him. And then because I'm in Vermont, I'm able to contact the US attorney and I stop into her office. So slowly I start to put together a mosaic of all these different voices around me, trying to understand how addiction is such a profound problem right now. I also seek to understand the why as well too. Who's vulnerable to addiction? What are the causes of it? And I reach out to people who are in recovery. And the first woman I speak to is very different than me and has had a very different life. And she opens up my eyes to a whole other aspect of small town Vermont that I had never seen before. But yet on some level, implicitly, I understood very, very well. I also reached out to a family who heartbreakingly had lost their daughter to an overdose. And all of these people I spoke to were very, very insightful from very different angles of addiction. The second story that winds through this is also my story as well, too. And it's the story of me confronting my past and my demons of addiction, even though I've been sober for years. So that evening that I found out this man had died, I realized that my whole past had driven what I was doing. And I hadn't acknowledged it, and I hadn't even begun to face that. And a different woman in that position might have made different choices, and there might have been a different outcome. Other important things to know about this book as I work through, addiction is not portrayed as an us versus them story. It was in my life, it is in my life, and it's in many other people's lives too, in one way or another. So the more I asked these questions and the harder I looked at the world I lived in, the more I realized the interconnectedness of all our stories. And that's a gray area, and it's a really difficult place to be. It's a part that fiction embraces beautifully, and it's one of the things I love about fiction. But for me, I began to see Fiction embraces that because it reflects the reality of the world we live in. And so that gray area is explored very deeply in this book as well, too. I think it's also important for me to say that the book isn't sanctimonious, as though someone struggling with addiction just needs to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and everything will be fine. But it's also not utterly bleak and hopeless either. And I had originally pursued the idea of writing this book because I wanted to find just a few good things. But what I ended up finding out was very different, was much stronger, and was much more profound. And it's really because I found these voices around me, as well as for myself, too. In terms of who I think will be interested in reading the book, I think those who have a personal and immediate connection to addiction will be very interested in reading it. But I think others will be very curious to read the book too, because the book is also about the connections and the obligations that we have to our neighbors and community members. These are really relevant questions for addiction, but they're really relevant questions now since the pandemic. And although the book is set in Vermont, these are very American questions, but they're magnified under the lens of a small town. And because I live in this small town where I'm able to stop in and speak to a local police chief and speak to local doctors, that I'm able to see more easily how individual actions and individual choices affect others. At the heart of its book, I think, is really a very philosophical question. How do we live in a world that's gone so far awry, and where is the way out of it? Not as a society as a whole, but as an individual. In what way can we find that light? I quote a very famous line in the book from Rumi: "The wound is the place where light enters." And I think, although I wrote that for myself as someone who is in recovery, and I wrote it for my town, I think it's also relevant for the times that we live in as well, too, for our country as a whole. We're wounded and we're looking for the way for light to come in. And in my experience, writing is one powerful way for the light to come in. In the end, my book, Unstitched, it arrows back to each one of us as individuals in a society that appears to be unraveling, literally unstitching apart. And the title comes from one of the family members who lost a child, saying, "How did we become so unstitched as a community?" In this book, I ask these questions, and I ask, how do individual lives have meaning in a world that appears chaotic and uncertain, like that afternoon when I heard the news that a stranger died? I discovered answers from people I came to know and understand. All the way along in all of my questions, I was given such generous answers, such profound answers. And every time that I doubted that I couldn't finish this book, I knew I had to, because I was carrying those voices forward. I hope you have a chance to also meet the people I wrote about and to also read my book. Thank you very much for having me.